Hello everybody and welcome back to another video by Funland Tutorials. Today's video is a requested topic, so thank you for requesting this topic. So today we'll be talking about a very important topic in international trade, and it is a very widely known model. So today we'll be discussing the preliminary assumptions of the Jones 1965 model. So let me just write that down. Jones 1965 model. This is a slightly advanced model in the sense that there are certain theories that have to be understood before we can understand the basics of this model. So if you want, I can make other videos which discuss the basic foundations of this model, but let me just start with what we have. So before we delve into the basic structure of the model itself, if we want to build a building, we'll have to first set up the foundation of the building, right? So we have, if you want to build a building, there needs to be a proper foundation, otherwise my building will collapse. So in today's video, essentially we'll be talking about only the assumptions of the Jones 1965 model. So let me just first say that there are primarily 8 assumptions. So there are essentially 8 assumptions, and what I'll be doing is I'll be writing down these 8 assumptions, and then I'll be taking one after the other and explaining what these assumptions essentially mean. Let me just change this font style so that way I can know what are the points that I need to discuss, and then we can move on accordingly. So the first point that the first assumption that happens in the Jones 1965 model, essentially what is this model discussing about? How does the world work in a Jones 1965 model? By 1965, this is something that needs to be mentioned. This 1965 is essentially the year in which the paper was published. The paper in which Jones's model was published, that year was 1965, and that is why we call this model as the Jones 1965 model, because the same gentleman had created another model in the year 1971, which came to be called the 1971 model. So essentially we'll be talking about only Jones's model, which was published in his paper in the year 1965. Now, in the world that Jones created in this 1965 model, essentially the economies that he considered were small open economies, right? So the economies, the small open economies. So we'll be discussing what small open economy means, but let me just write down the assumptions. So the second assumption that he talked about was that it's a two-sector economy. So essentially each economy has only 2 sectors. Suppose we consider the 2 sectors, one to be an agricultural sector, so one is the agricultural sector and the other is the manufacturing sector. Again, there are specifications of why we are taking an agricultural sector and a manufacturing sector. That assumption is sort of connected to another assumption, which is why I am writing down all the assumptions together. So this model has 2 sectors. It also has 2 factors of production. So there are 2 factors of production. What are the 2 factors of production? Essentially they are labor and capital. So we consider 2 factors of production. Factors of production essentially mean the raw materials essentially from which we make our production. So the economy has only 2 factors of production, and it can produce using these 2 factors. The fourth assumption is about the CRS production function. So how does the production function look like? How does it behave in the real world in the Jones 1965 model? So this is a CRS production function, and another thing that happens here is the diminishing property, the diminishing marginal productivity property. That property also holds. So this property, this is a very common property that is discussed. So this property is also holding. So that's nothing new to be discussed. Then the 5th assumption is the full employment assumption. So essentially all factors are completely employed. There are no unused factors of production, and something that is pretty special for this model is full mobility of factors. So essentially factors are characterized by 2 properties. full employment and full mobility. Then we have the intensity, factor intensity essentially. This is a rather important assumption, the factor intensities in this model, and that needs to be discussed a little. So the seventh point is again pretty factor mobility. The seventh point is again a pretty standard and a straightforward assumption. We assume perfect competition. So what are the implications of perfect competition? Essentially the prices are all given. So we cannot control the prices that are available in the market. And the final assumption is that is not a very strict assumption, but it's a possible assumption. What we take is we take the agricultural commodity. So we had considered that there are two sectors. Essentially it means that the economy is producing two goods, agricultural goods and manufacturing goods. So we can actually take the agricultural goods. So we can take the agricultural goods to be the numeraire. Now let's take one point at a time and find out what essentially they mean. So let's first talk about the small open economy assumption. Now when I talk about small open economy, it essentially doesn't mean a geographically small. So this word small, this is not geographically small. Essentially it is talking about countries which have so let me just write that down. Small is not geographically small. Suppose consider the country of Bangladesh, for example, not geographically small. So consider the country of Bangladesh, for example. Bangladesh is a rather small economy, right? It's cradled by India on three of its sides, and on the fourth side it has the Bay of Bengal. So it's a pretty small economy. However, if we consider the Jones 1965 model, where we have to consider Bangladesh as one of the economies, and suppose we are considering one of the agricultural products, say for example as jute. Now what happens is, in spite of being a geographically small economy, Bangladesh actually has a pretty large share in the export and import of jute. So essentially Bangladesh is a big player in the international jute market. So what happens is, being a big player, it can control the price and quantity of the jute market, international jute market. So what happens is, essentially this is sort of connected to the perfect competition assumption. So what happens is, we have learned in microeconomics that in case of perfect competition, firms take prices as given, right? They cannot influence the market. Every firm, in case of standard perfect competition, every firm is insignificantly small when considering the entire market. So essentially they cannot control the market. They just take whatever is given. That same logic of small firm which cannot influence the market, a pretty similar interpretation happens when we consider small open economies over here. By small, essentially we mean the share of the so essentially small here essentially means the country has a small share of market. So it controls a very small share of the, it rather does not have control over the market. Essentially it is a small part of the market. So that is what I mean by small. The share of its exports and imports in the international market is small. It is rather an insignificant player in the international market. It's not geographically small. The country may be geographically small. For example, Bangladesh may be a geographically small economy, but it has a pretty big share. So there may be larger countries again which have a small share. The countries, it might be geographically big, it might have a large area, covering a large area, but it might have a very small share in influencing the market. In that case, we would be considering that to be a small economy, even if it's a large, geographically large economy. And open is pretty straightforward. Open means that it participates in international trade, it exports and imports. So that is what I mean by the first assumption. Now what is the second assumption? Second assumption is again pretty straightforward. The country has two sectors essentially. So it has an agricultural sector and manufacturing sector. Now why are we considering agriculture and manufacturing sector all of a sudden? Because for developing countries, in a lot of developing countries, services sector may not be a very flourishing sector, for example. So agricultural economy for most developing countries is a labor intensive sector, right? We use a lot of labor in agricultural sector, and in manufacturing sector a lot of capital is used. So in this model we'll be representing L, labor as L and capital as K. So that essentially boils down to the next assumption. So there are two factors of production, labor and capital, right? So agriculture also, now the thing is, it's not that agriculture just uses labor and manufacturing just uses capital. Both the sectors use labor and capital. So you produce agricultural commodities using labor and capital, and you use manufacturing commodities using labor and capital. But then where is this point coming? So we discussed the second point and we discussed the third point. Let me just go to the sixth point once. So where does this factor intensity thing come into play? Essentially, by factor intensity, I'm not going into the mathematics, we'll be having a separate video on factor intensity. Essentially it means agriculture uses more labor than manufacturing, and manufacturing uses more capital than agriculture. So essentially we say agriculture is labor intensive and manufacturing is capital intensive. So essentially that is what I mean by the factor intensity assumption. We assume that agricultural commodities are labor intensive and manufacturing commodities are capital intensive, which is a pretty realistic assumption, so to say. Agricultural commodities are labor based, right? You need a lot of labor for it's a very hand to hand production, whereas manufacturing requires a lot of capital and machinery and everything else. So we have discussed the factor intensity assumption as well. The fourth assumption is again pretty standard. There is no such interpretation to be discussed. It's just a CRS, so constant returns to scale production function, and the diminishing marginal productivity holds. So as you keep increasing your factors, that is labor and capital, the marginal productivity increases but at a diminishing rate. So that is a standard, again a standard assumption. The fifth point is again more or less standard. So full employment means that once you are producing, once you have started producing, you won't have any remaining factor of production unemployed. So you won't have some people just sitting idle waiting to get a job. All labor and capital factors will always be completely employed and they'll always be working. So you won't have unutilized resources. Full mobility is again rather important assumption. By full mobility, essentially I mean to say that this labor can move from the agricultural sector to manufacturing sector. So one fine morning, if a labor wants to feel, I don't want to work in the agricultural sector anymore, I want to work in the manufacturing sector right now, that is possible. So there are no such barriers which restrict capital or labor flow from one sector to the other. So that is what I mean by full mobility. The factors are fully mobile. Mobile means that they can move from one sector to another. The seventh assumption, again as I mentioned before, is a sort of like a standard assumption again. It's a perfect competition, so prices are given. So these factors, the factor prices are given. So the country doesn't decide what factors, what factor prices it moves through. So W, R, example. We'll be discussing the symbols in another video. I'm just giving the brief assumptions. So those are all given. You cannot control them. Or at least in perfect competition, it's maybe we don't take it as given. We can find out the prices, but essentially the perfect competition assumption that how those are determined in the market, that holds. So prices are given through the market essentially. And then we have the eighth assumption, which is not always applicable, but you can apply it when you want. The agricultural goods are taken to be the numeraire. So essentially what happens is, in that case, let me just give you a brief idea. We say that the price of agricultural good is 1. We can fairly assume that without loss of generality, we can assume that price of agricultural goods is 1. So essentially if I say price of initially, if suppose price of manufacturing goods was say 6 and price of agricultural was say 2. Now if I say that price of agricultural goods is 1, So the increase was by 3, factor of 3. So I have to assume that the price of manufacturing goods is 3. It's sort of like that. So we consider the agricultural goods to be the numeric. Essentially, these 6 are the basic assumptions of the Jones 1965 model. They act as the foundation on which the Jones 1965 model is built. Now, there are certain symbols that need to be understood because this model has a bold equational structure that needs to be understood through the equations, as is very evident. So, we will be covering the equations and the notations in future videos.